Hello, everyone. We are very excited to be here and have Hugo Spiers with us this week. And if you have just joined us this week, the Learning Salon is an interdisciplinary forum where we gather every week and we discuss bridges and contentions between biological and artificial learning. We have folks who work, in various species. We have folks who work only in ML or RL. We have folks who are philosophers, and there's a lot of discussions. Disagreement, even if it's strong intellectual disagreement, is totally okay, but we do not tolerate disrespect. So make sure if you're making a disagreement, make sure that it's respectful, make sure that nobody's being disrespected in any possible way, and you're welcome to share your opinions. We especially encourage junior members of the audience to pose questions. There is an Ask a Question button below. Please ask your questions there. And Hugo's receiving compliments about his hair right now in the chat. There is also
good hair.
There's also a chat area that if you have any clarification questions during the talk, you can put your information there. And we have Kanaka and we have Brad who are going to help out and answer some of the clarification questions. And we can hear John typing at this moment.
Yeah. Honestly, I could dissolve in a puddle of self-consciousness with you. I know that.
And so with all of that, I think that Hugo's presence is a fantastic continuation to those kinds of weeks where we've been discussing various aspects of navigation in rodents, in humans, in models, especially in reinforcement learning models. We've had Kim Stackenfeld two weeks ago. We had Caswell last week, which was probably the longest salon. And we had Tim Behrens join us at the end of the last salon, and we discussed a lot of models and future directions. We have Hugo now. And usually we try to give an introduction in these sessions. That's not the formal introduction. Hugo has a strangely impressive trail of papers that I don't understand how he manages to publish so much. He's very productive. He's also a dad. And something that was very impressive was that all of his trainees and mentees are always very fond of him. And the productivity goes hand in hand with good mentorship. And I think that's very important and sometimes overlooked and underappreciated. I've had the opportunity to work with one of Hugo's trainees, Eva Brunig, which has been, and it still is, a fantastic pleasure every time I talk to her. Hugo also designed this Sequest, am I saying their name right?
Sea Hero Quest, yeah.
Sea Hero Quest mobile game, and collected a lot of data that helped to compare the different populations from different cultures, their navigation abilities, and they compared it with socioeconomical status of folks and their gender and the interaction between the social status of women and their navigation ability, and they found very interesting results, which I think he might tell us a little bit about. You should definitely check it out and follow the links in his slides. I have been very fortunate to also, once I wrote a review for a journal issue that he was editing, and it was a fantastic experience of patience and care that was provided. That was very important for that work to be able to come to fruition. So I really appreciated that. So with this non-formal introduction, Hugo, we would love to hear your talk. And I want to remind everyone to ask a question in the Ask a Question area below and vote on each other's question. We will invite the top voted questions and some of them that fit with the flow of the conversation on screen. And take it away.
Thank you so much, Ida. That's a really lovely introduction. It's a bit weird with these headphones because I can't hear myself so well, but hopefully this will work well. I've been enjoying.
Excellent.
Yeah, good. The quality of the salon has been amazing. Last time I spoke in a salon, I realized, was 9 years ago, and it was one of those in person. Obviously, this was in person back 9 years ago, but it was an art salon with literary novelists, and you could get away with anything in that context. But I don't think I'll get away with anything here at all. And I'm delighted to be held account for all sorts of things here, and we can have a good discussion, I hope. I've avoided learning in my career as well, I should add, going into the learning salon. It's always been something I think, oh, we'll just focus on once people have learned something and examine it. But more over time, I sort of crept into understanding how do we learn things. So it's a great time. So yeah, I'll go and start sharing some slides, and hopefully they'll work. We'll see. Okay, let's see where we are. Share screen. Okay. So you should be seeing my title screen. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see perfect.
Great. So I can't see any view or any information on what's being shown. I remember Kaz was commenting on this last time, but hopefully it'll work. So I'm going to talk about neural systems for navigation. I'll try and cover this in about 15 minutes or so, not longer. This is the aim. And then produce a lot of discussion, I hope. And I'm really going to try and bring out a flavor of the different things we've been doing quite superficially. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in various places and hope we can pick up some of those things, but I'll just sort of tip into different bits of the work. But I'm going to try and tackle into 4 questions in this short drive through the work we've been doing. One is, how might the brain represent vectors, paths, and connections in an environment, particularly in relation to goal coding? How do we actually navigate? So much of the work's focused on foraging experiments, but how do actually animals, humans, rats, other animals actually navigate and code information? What makes someone good at navigating has been a question in the last 5 years or so I've been really interested in. What can we learn from experts? So London taxi drivers, when we think about navigation, really are the world experts for humans I can think of. And I'll be presenting some new data on those particular individuals in a moment. And we'll end on looking today, because of the focus of this salon, on what we can learn from comparing the navigation of different species, in our case humans and rats, to simulated reinforcement learning agents. What does this tell us? So let's start with that first one about how we might represent distance, direction, and connections. But I mean, distances and directions are the absolute sort of hub of what we do when we navigate. We have to go somewhere, we have to go in a certain distance in a direction. And throughout my career, I've really been interested in that problem of navigation, when you have to work out where you are and remember where your goal you're trying to get to is, and think about how you're situated in the environment. A lot of navigation doesn't involve that. You just sort of step out of your house and you go to the shop, and you're using different circuits of your brain to the kind of ones I'm interested in, which are, how do we solve that complex sort of often planning problem of like options, and how do we think about the space we're in? And that comes down to the third part there about how we think about the connections in the environment we're in. How do we represent the structure, the topology of the space? So some of this work goes back to 2007, when I was working in the Phil, the Wellcome Trust Centre for Neuroimaging, with Ellen McGuire, studying London taxi drivers. And we put a group of 20 of them in a £2 million virtual simulation of London. They had to drive a black cab through the streets of London. That's a picture of Trafalgar Square in the simulation. And this was a game called The Getaway, which is a terrible game, but amazing expenditure in terms of the space. And what we found in this particular study, because we're using functional magnetic resonance imaging, we could look and see, one of the first studies to look and see, are there parts of the brain that actually correlate in their activity levels with the distance or the direction to the target where the taxi drivers are trying to go. And we found in this particular study that the entorhinal subicular part of the taxi driver's brain the activity there was correlated with the Euclidean distance, like in a straight line. And so that was with London taxi driving. They're amazing. They have to study, it takes about 4 years to qualify to do that job. And they have to memorize about 58,000 street names and how they're all interrelated. We're about to release an article, so submit an article soon on how they do that learning. But it's quite a remarkable feat. But anyway, we could see this activity there. Several years later in my lab, 2 students and postdocs, Lorelei Howard and Amir Javadi, did some fantastic work where we, rather than £2 million, we spent £500 to create, with a film crew, to recreate Soho in high definition film, which is a sort of very fancy part of London where the streets are very short and it's very convoluted. We could also see in that study that activity in the entorhinal subicular region was coding the distance to the goal. So this is a bit we heard from Caswell last week, talking about grid cells. So it seems quite likely that there's something about the way in which grid cells code space. These cells provide activity patterns that with tessellating grid-like coverage of the space. And it seems quite likely that that might be why we're seeing Euclidean distances coded there. But in these studies, we found, in addition, that the hippocampus was more active the further away along the path participants were to their target, which is consistent with the idea that perhaps as we're navigating, are the place cells that Caswell discussed last week. I'll show some in a moment. These cells in the hippocampus in rats, and we've also seen them in humans in some studies, that they might be activating patterns along paths, the structure of the space through the streets. We've also been looking in the last few years at what happens when you know an environment really well. So this is the Royal Albert Hall in London, where Imperial College students might navigate around, and we pitted the brains of Imperial College students with University College London students against each other in this study to see how their brains reactivated when they were navigating their own campus or each other's campus when they just learned it, and found again the same sorts of hippocampal tracking of distance but only when it was a new environment, not when they'd known it for well over 2 years. So we're starting to see that part. And then also more recently, we've been simulating virtual environments. People have to navigate around desert islands with lava running through them to simulate dynamic environments and play around with the affordances that the environment in a more controlled way we can produce. The upshot of that is more or less covered in a review I wrote with Russell Epstein, Zita Bataille, and Josh Julian back in 2017. That's a really comprehensive review tackling how over the different steps we go through navigating, we might see different parts of the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex active. And that summarizes really just simply that the hippocampal activity in these fMRI studies correlates with the distance to the goal in a variety of situations, not all, but in many of the ones we've looked at. Whereas we see the entorhinal subicular area correlating with the goal vector. And that includes other studies. There's a very nice study a few years back by Thomas Wolber's lab looking at coding goal directions. In both that study and the ones we've done, it seems like it's an allocentric direction. So is it towards the north or the south of you in terms of the directional information in that part of the brain? We also see that the hippocampus in this particular study, where we had people go through SOHO, that the posterior hippocampal activity would increase when people stepped into a bit of space that had more connections, it was more locally connected in the environment, than when it was like a dead end or very few connections, suggesting the hippocampus not only is tracking information in the activity related to distance, but also what's possible, what can I do? Again, I'd argue links back theoretically to the idea that place cells exist in the hippocampus of all mammalian species, and that they can activate map to space ahead of a person and explore possibilities through space, not just code the immediate position of the rat or the human. Also, I should add that we see in these studies across these different paradigms, medial prefrontal regions correlated with distance to the goal, which may relate more to tracking progress towards a reward. And I've got a review coming out in about a week or so, we hope, in Trends in Cognitive Sciences on what do all the different prefrontal regions do when we navigate. What do we see across lots and lots of studies that have found activity patterns in the frontal cortex? So look out for that review that Zita, Bataille, and myself have written. So I'm going to jump now from humans and fMRI to rats and talk about
Hugo, can I ask?
Of course.
Can you click on the blue hide button that is below your screen? It's abstract some of the text. Thank you.
I've lost, yeah. Great. So, great. Okay. I didn't realize that was showing as well. So hopefully you can see without that now. So this is a study that Eleanor Devell and Roddy Greaves were involved in setting up and running. So we've gone from looking at fMRI in humans. So fMRI can help us reveal how dynamic human activity is linked to representations potentially by correlating activity to things like the distance. When we do the kind of work that Caswell described last week of recording from tetrodes in rats running in mazes, and in this maze is composed of 4 different identical looking gray rooms, and the rooms are connected by little doors. We're interested in this experiment in terms of how might the individual cells that we can record in the area CA1 in the dorsal hippocampus, so similar to the homologue to where I was looking at distance coding in humans, and how are they in any way affected by if you change the connections in the environment. We've known that the cells can code the space for a long time, since John O'Keefe discovered place cells in the 1970s. But what if you were to change the way that the animal can move around? And Eleanor had a clever idea of putting little bells up in the corners of the maze. So a bit like Pavlov's dogs, these rats learn to run to bells when they're rung in different rooms, and they learn to navigate efficiently through the maze. So here's an example of a rat, hopefully the movie will work, going through one of our saloon-style doors that Eleanor very cleverly built for this experiment. And I'll show a movie of what happens when you put a little pin at the top of the door. Oops, there we are. And the rat will hopefully, there you go, behave. walk up and it can't get through the door. We've locked the door, but there's no sensory information other than the fact the door is locked to stop it passing through. So we're curious to see now the structure of that environment has changed in terms of what the animal can or cannot do. How does its hippocampal map represent the space? We first of all found the rats were actually quite quicker than I expected them to be, at least, at learning that there was a blocked door and they needed to reroute when getting to their food. But when we look at the place cell map, so we're predicting that perhaps the fields, the representations of the space that we can see in individual cells might remap, might change the way they code the space. And that's not what we found. So we just published this a couple of weeks ago in Current Biology. So you can go and look at the paper that's in Current Biology. And there's a lot of it, very careful analysis that Eleanor and Roddy put into this work. Really, really fantastic amount of effort. And what we saw was nothing really. A very fantastic null result in the sense of very scrutinized the data excessively and showed that the place cells just don't really at all remap to changes. So what we've got here are 2 sessions where the rat runs around, like you can see, and okay, again. And if there was going to be a dramatic change, we'd expect to see it when the door gets locked, and we don't see that. And we can look at rate map correlations, we can look at Bayesian decoding of the fields, we can look around the doors, we can look at all sorts of properties of the way the cells might code the space, but we don't see that. So that's telling us something, that the hippocampal map doesn't remap in the sense of fields, where the fields are allocated the space shift when you change the connections in terms of what's possible. What we were surprised to see was that the place cells, and here's examples of, so here are where an individual cell is, and this is one individual cell, another cell, and so on, how it's coding the space, and that we can see that you get a diversity of patterns, but really they don't repeat. You occasionally see these kind of repetitions that Roddy and I had seen in different work, but nothing like the levels we'd seen in previous repeated structured environments. For some reason, in this space where rats have to go around, we're not getting the repetitions we saw, which is opening interesting questions to how can future studies predict when you will get this sort of repetition that's been seen in previous studies. So when do you get this sort of pattern, or this sort of pattern? It's a very interesting question to go forward. I'll pick on some. Here's a nice piece of data that Roddy pulled out, I remember, from the data, showing the centroids of all the place fields. If you're looking around, this picks up on something Caswell was talking about last time, that there's a very fantastic uniform coverage of the space across the 4 rooms in the environment. There's not some specific parts that are overrepresented. Caswell mentioned that doorways can be overrepresented in some studies, and that's certainly what I'd found before. But in this particular study with saloon doors, we don't find that whatsoever. There's no overrepresentation. So again, it's sort of helping us understand what place cells do or do not find interesting. So I'm going to shift tack again, because I'm going to jump to a new part of the this sort of run through different studies we've been doing. I'll pick up on what Ida mentioned in the intro, that we've been also asking, in this case in humans, what makes someone a good navigator? Some of those rats were much smarter than others. We don't know why. It's very hard to study that in rats with looking in the brain. It's very difficult to get lots and lots of them. With humans, given that we're all carrying mobile phones around with us now, it's been possible in the last few years with touchscreen technology and video games to make that possible. So in 2016, I was able to collaborate with Michael Hornberger at the University of East Anglia, and we were given funds to allow us to employ a games development company to produce a high-quality video game that we could embed a virtual reality navigation task in that would test people remotely. And they could pick up, download an app, and play this game anywhere in the world, anytime they wanted, in a bar, in bed, wherever they happened to be, traveling on the tube, wherever, in those days when people got out. So back in 2018, we published the first report in Current Biology of what we could see from this game. I'll show you what the game actually looks like. So some of you may have played it, but the game's called Sea Hero Quest, and you play an explorer trying to find fragments of a missing map. And in the game, once you've learned the tutorial levels, you're given maps like this where you've got to get to different checkpoints. There are various parts of the game that I don't have time to go into, but the major part is finding your way to checkpoints. So you can see where you start, and there are various checkpoints to reach. You close the map and you head off. And in this game, you play a little boat, and you can swipe left, you can tap left or right, or swipe to go faster. And this is a very good player we're watching. So they're doing a particularly good job of navigating around. So they're tapping. The whole time this person is navigating around, we're tracking every 500 milliseconds where they are and which orientation they're facing. That data is then being uploaded back to a server that's being fed to us in London for analysis. And each of these trajectories, all of this information is being fed in back to us for analysis. And we were extremely fortunate to have 3.9 million people take part and share their data in this way. And a lot of that goes down to the advertising that the company funding it, T-Mobile, were able to plow into it. Really made a big difference. So what I'm going to show you now is a massive, massive downsample from 3.9 million people, because you just can't see if we plot all that data on top of it. I'm going to show you just 1,000 older people and 1,000 younger people, each as a little icon traveling through one of our levels. So you get a sense of what the data looks like. So we'll see them all starting in the top left, and they have to get to a checkpoint. So the top left is where all the participants start. And in red are the younger participants who are moving faster and more systematically through the space. So these people are all independently playing it. They can't see each other. It's just that we're overlaying all the people's data from 2,000 people. And you can see a small number of people making a mistake there. And we can see that an older participant's actually in the lead at the front. The little blue icon is somebody who is says they're older, and they just get pipped at the post at the last minute by 3 participants. What you can highlight here is that there's a huge amount of diversity. The data is extremely rich with 3.9 million people. This is one of 75 levels in the game. There's a lot of things we've got sitting in that data, and we'll be making.
Hugo,
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't actually understand what the instruction was.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
So they were given a map that they had to memorize in their head. It was then taken away, and they had to remember it.
That's
in
right.
Their head. Is that
That's
what they had
right.
to
You
do?
guessed right. Yeah, that was the right test. So it's a navigation task where you got to find your way to 3 markers, or it might be up to 5, just based on looking at the map.
So why is that why is that a navigation task rather than just memorizing?
So yeah, we are tapped. So it's that type of navigation that I mentioned at the beginning. So rather than sort of stepping out of your door and going somewhere you know well, this is that horrible experience of, oh, we're going somewhere new we've not been, but here's a map. You've got to memorize this map very quickly and then head out into this space. And people.
Right, but that's got nothing to. Just my last question, so I understand. I mean, obviously, rodents
Yes, that's
don't
a good
do
point.
that.
Yes, so
in
actually.
other words, so when you went from
There's a
rodent
big
to
gap.
human, it's meaningless to talk about
No,
rodents
you're right. And I will
consulting
pick
a
up on
map.
that. That's a really good point. And it's something I'll pick up on the last few slides. Hopefully I'll get to in the 15 minutes. I'll pick up on that exact issue, that how do you then go about comparing rodents and humans in some meaningful way? Because this data here is not going to do that. I have had people approach me who want to get primates to play this, but we haven't yet done that. As in non-human primates. So the data is extremely rich. Every one of those people who takes part, we can benchmark, we can measure what the distance they traveled. Those people you're looking at there would have extremely long distance. They haven't managed to succeed in the task. And we can measure people who are extremely accurate. So questions we wonder were, what makes a good navigator? So we'll be showing you some of this data in a moment, but one of the most strikingly strong effects in the data was age. And I was hoping that maybe you could go through life pretty good at navigating, and then maybe there's a sort of big fall off as you get quite old. And that's not at all what we saw. Worldwide, in every country, in every nation, we see a linear decline pretty much from the youngest age, around 20 onwards. It just gets worse. It's not a good outcome. There's a male advantage all around the world. Every country we could see where we had good data, men seem to do a bit better than women. And we'll come back to that and look at why. So one of the things we reported in our paper was that if you look at navigation across all the countries in the world that we've got reasonable data sample from, they cluster into 5 groups. We do not know why they're clustered into 5 groups. Other metrics of world performance don't cluster in this way, but there seem to be 5 sort of tribes of navigators. But significantly, what we were able to find was that if you look at the mode rank, conditional modes rank in a linear model, so we're fitting the data to try and explain the impact of different parameters on the data. So can we predict the navigation performance? And one of those metrics is an entry code for each country in the world. And what we can do is take that out and rank these countries and rank them against their GDP capita. And what we find is that the countries with high GDP, so high income and wealth, produce better navigators. And it's a bit depressing in some ways. So having lots of money, education, healthcare, these things take people into a state where they're navigating better. Some of the top countries you can see are countries where there's a lot of people who drive. And we commented in the paper that perhaps in Scandinavia, there might be other effects, such as the fact they're trained to navigate at school that might give them an unfair advantage. But we see certain patterns, but GDP seems to be one of the things that explains why people from certain nations might be better at navigating. But as I mentioned, what might explain that male advantage? It's been long sitting in the literature, but we haven't really had a great take on it. But here we have a huge amount of data to look at. And we notice that some countries, there's almost no difference between men and women, but others, there's a huge difference. What we were able to do was to take the difference between men and women in the performance for population data and compare that to the World Economic Forum's measure of gender inequality to see if these things are related. And I wouldn't be telling you that if there wasn't some link. So it's not quite as strong the correlation as GDP, but there's certainly a clear relationship there, particularly if you ignore some outliers like Malaysia and the Korean Republic. But there's clearly countries where there's very small difference in between men and women, and a very small difference in this gender gap index. So what is that? That gender gap index is a measure of how much access to healthcare, education, how many women are in parliament, a whole range of metrics that account for differences within a country between men and women. And so this, to us, certainly suggests that a lot of these differences we might see in spatial tasks, like our video game measure of navigation, is a lot to do with the way we're raised and culturally experiencing our environment through these cultures. So there'll be more research on this, I'm sure, but here we can see what might be driving the gender imbalance is culture. Finally, on the See Here request, we've got a preprint released last year, which was still plowing our way through doing more and more analysis to hone in, to ask the question, does it matter where you grew up? So I grew up in a city, but I had access to the countryside. Some people just grew up in a city. Others might grow up in a really rural location. Does this really confer benefits or disadvantages? And in this case, what we were able to do was to compare. We found that sort of the data clustered into those who said they grew up in a city or outside a city or mixed. So we can compare people who grew up in cities to non-city environments. And when we do that, what we see is this pattern in our graph. So what we're looking at here in the y-axis is the wayfinding performance. So up at the top is being good, and low on this is bad, and this is age. So you can see before I mentioned that age is not good, and that from the earliest age around 20, there's a sort of general linear decline. And you can see that general worldwide male advantage, that men are doing better across the lifetime, not really an interaction between age and gender. But shown in this graph, importantly, is the difference between people who say they grew up in a city, who are doing worse at every point. So here's a time point where, later in life at 70, there's quite a big drop of for people who say they grew up in a city. But like all these data, not every country has the same effect. Some countries have a very small difference between people who grew up in cities and non-cities. Others, there's a really big effect. So for some reason, Argentina has a very big effect. Canada has a big effect. The USA has a big effect. We wondered if we could get a handle on this. And a few years back, we'd noticed that Jeff Boeing, who's a geographer, had developed a way of categorizing every city in the world based on its street network entropy. So measuring how much entropy you can measure in the connections between the streets, how organized. So Chicago has a very low entropy. It's a highly organized city. The streets generally run in two axes through the space, but Prague and the Czech Republic is somewhat chaotic. And places like Sao Paulo are just a complete mess, just completely uniform in different directions. So what that allowed us to do is to sample the cities for each of 38 countries, the top cities, and measure how gritty, what's their entropy of these countries. So I'm now going to show a graph of the entropy on the y-axis and the effect on the x-axis. So the further to the right, the worse the negative impact of cities is. And we found a correlation, a negative correlation between the amount of street network entropy the cities in a country have and how much impact they have on the negative impact growing up in a city has. So we can see that countries like the United States and Argentina and Canada, are much more impacted by growing up in a city, and that appears to be related to the street network. Just for time, because we want to get through lots of bits of data, I won't show it now. But if you look at the paper, we go back into the game data, and we've got different levels that vary in how much entropy the game levels have. The one I showed you in the video was very low. It's not a very complicated level, but there are some that are very high. And we found that the countries which have the city dwellers from countries with gritty cities are really bad at navigating these highly convoluted levels. If anything, there's a slight advantage, though, for those people who grew up in countries with gritty cities, in quite structured levels in our game. So what we're seeing is a nice parallel in the actual data in our game. So if you want to know more, go and look at our bioarchive article to have a look at that. So I'm going to go from looking at 3.9 million people to 40 people, but this time they're not random people from all over the world in different countries. They are London taxi drivers. So we decided we run a new study, the first time I'm discussing this in any format. So this is new data. And we wanted to see how taxi drivers plan. Tim was just, sorry, just been asked, John was asking about, it was just a memory test. You saw a map and you had to remember it. Here, this is navigation entirely in the head, in the mind of taxi drivers. They're recalling different streets out of 58,000 they've memorized. So we're giving them a task. We go up to them in the street, they sign ethics, and then they do our task. Whoop, we'll hear that voice in a moment. And the task is to do what they did do in their exam. Exact exam is, we'll give you an origin, here, O, and a destination. And what you must do as a taxi driver to pass this test, to get your license, is tell me every single street along a straight line, an imaginary straight line connecting the Euclidean line, in the right order, and tell us which way you'd be turning into them. It takes 4 years to pass that. It's so much, and a lot of people fail. But here is a qualified taxi driver. I'll play his voice, and it's been distorted just to anonymize him further. It makes him sound even more rough and like one of these taxi drivers than he might otherwise do. But you're going to hear him recall, and you'll see him passing through the space.
I can't really hear him.
We can't hear him.
Oh, you can't hear him. That's interesting. Okay, you'll have to have me pretending to give his voice. So we've written it out there.
It's a shame. Off, we could hear him.
Ah, that might be risky though. I don't know if I can. Maybe we'll leave that. It's the only audio in it. Anyway, I'm sorry. Maybe people are gonna, when they get this eventually, they'll hear this really rough voice of a taxi driver talking through. What is important in what I was displaying there is that the stepping through that space is not uniform. They don't just start slow and speed up, and they don't slow down. It's got bits in it that are really slow. And what we wanted to understand was why. Why do taxi drivers, if they're recalling a route and stepping through it in their mind, take ages to think about some streets and not others? Why are some just this, So what we can do with this is look at the response times, the gaps between the words of the streets. And we can then take all the data from 43 taxi drivers recalling a whole range of routes and try and model that data from 4,000 different events and see if we can predict why they are so slow. Why is this gap I'm showing here so long? What is it the taxi driver is having to compute? And first of all, it's important. I'm just going to show that route again now from a set of 18 taxi drivers where they took that route. And you can see that he paused a long time on Shaftesbury Avenue, the previous taxi driver, but that they all do. They almost all pause for a long time when they're thinking about Shaftesbury Avenue for this route. So what I'm showing here on this y-axis, each of these is a street and they're being recalled in the order, passing through from the start to the end. And this particular street, the average Z score show it's really taking a long time, but they're quite quick at the end. Why? So we can take a number of parameters into a linear model and try and again fit that model and predict why. What are the parameters that explain planning here through this massive 58,000 unit state space? This is absolutely vast. Now, in some ways, you would expect if they're using a breadth first search to take some time at the beginning to work their way through this, and it should speed up significantly. So distance through the network should be a strong predictor, but that's not what we see. So in our paper we're working on submitting soon, this is work by Eva Griesbauer, who just got her PhD awarded a couple of weeks back. And this is the output of her model. So what I'm showing on here, we're modeling the log reaction time, these gaps between the words, how long it's taken them between streets. And we're looking at the model, the parameters in that model that can hopefully predict the pattern. And you can see that the Euclidean distance to the target really does not help predict at all the patterns. And the number of streets, the number of steps ahead is also very low. The distance is not a useful metric for taxi drivers planning. What matters is if they have to take a mental turn through space, that's the most strong striking factor. If they have to step onto a main road, they get very slow. There are more options. These are really important, massive conduits. But if they step onto what they would self-describe as a boundary street, they're much quicker. So this provides some evidence that they're chunking and processing aspects of the street network in order to optimize their planning through it. They are unbelievably quick. And there's a lot more we'll come back to when we come to present that data in a paper soon. Okay, I'm wrapping up now this talk, and I'm going to answer that question that was raised earlier about in C Hero Quest, you give people a map, they have to memorize it, that it's all how could you possibly compare that to rats? And if you're interested in place cells, surely you want to do that. And that's exactly what we do want to do. So several years back, we started a progress of how could we build an environment that would test rats and make them, that they would succeed, they would find challenging but do well, but they would also really push humans. Like the Morris Water Maze has been great for rodent navigation. So this is, you put a rat or a mouse in a pool of water and it has to find a submerged platform. It works great, but it's extremely boring for humans to do. And it doesn't really push the topics and things I've been interested in the same way about how you might represent distances and directions when you're, or particular connections. So we started taking the idea of the Morris Water Maze of having rats and humans navigate to points in space in an arena type space, but now we block the environment is in a dynamic state and is changing, so that you have to avoid obstacles to get to your target. And so what we did, we built something we call the Tartarus Maze, which is like comes after a Jason Argonaut's film, I think it is, where there's a horrendous maze in one of these films that keeps reconfiguring itself all the time. And that's what we put our rats and humans through, and indeed simulated reinforcement learning agents having to find their way through this maze. So I'll show you now. Here's top left is a picture of a rat on one of our mazes. There's a big black wall queue in a version here. And it's made of 100 of these wells where we can release superior chocolate milk from Waitrose for rats, or if it's humans navigating in immersive virtual reality, can release tokens that they can get money. So we have food-deprived rats and financially deprived students searching for rewards in these mazes. And the key thing we can do is remove the floor. And you can see here's a simulation in virtual reality that Chris Ganstrom, who's in my lab, is currently working on building. It's not the one that's in our archive paper, but we recommend you have a look at the archive paper. So what we're seeing in this top image is a top-down view of a rat trying to solve this maze. You can see that there's a goal, that's where the rat's getting chocolate milk. And there's chocolate milk all over this environment. There are other locations, so it's not easy to use smell. But the rats are actually extremely good at avoiding these obstacles and learning and adapting to the environment. But this took a fair bit of work to get rats to do this sort of task, to make it work. We had a lot of pilot work to get this to work. But we're now in the process of recording from tetrodes, and we're about to hopefully, with restrictions easing, record from human brains with fMRI and piece these two things together into the same system. But what I'm going to run over very briefly is some analysis that William Ducote ran when he was a PhD student in my lab. He's the first author on our archive paper looking at this. So we collected and integrated the data from rodents and from humans solving this task. So the rat is being placed on the edge of the environment, and they have to get to the goal. You can see that rat took a pretty bad route to the target. It could have gone the other way. So we can look at those trajectories and we can see how they compare. What's the dwell, where these, like that rat there avoided that dead end very nicely on the third go. Do humans do that? And an important question is, which reinforcement learning agents show the same sort of patterns? So I'll run through that in a moment. So here is a schematic of that task. You've got rat, a human, and a reinforcement learning agent navigating to these targets. They spend initially time learning the environment completely with no blocks until they've got a good understanding of where the goal is. The goal in this particular experiment doesn't move, but we are exploring that in new work. But here are the 25 different mazes. Now what happens is on the first time they encounter the maze, they'll do 10 different trials, getting their way to the goal. Each will start in a different place, like the movie you saw. And after 10 trials, the maze reconfigures. So what was a good trajectory before is no longer good. The humans, animals, and reinforcement learning agents have to reassess and re-update their model of where they can and cannot go in the environment, in the state space of these 10 units that we can look at. So what we can do then is take the data and try and fit. We can then create. So Will Ducote is now a postdoc in Caswell's lab, who's mentioned last week, looking at how we can model reinforcement learning agents to consider representations. So before joining Caswell's lab, he worked, and indeed Caswell is a key collaborator on this particular project as well. It's rather incestuous in UCL's spatial cognition world. But here what we can do is to take the data from rats and humans and try and fit their data into reinforcement learning models and work out what the optimal parameters would be to fit these agents, these real biological agents, into those models, to what are the value representations in the reinforcement learning models, and to then do a comparison of those models to see which ones effectively explain the biological data best. So we're in this particular instantiation of this work, we looked at the three sort of classic reinforcement learning model frameworks of model-free learning, where the model is updating a state action value. It's learning Q values, and presumably discussed at length in these salons. But the reinforcement learning agent is learning what the best action I can take at every step. Whereas a model-based reinforcement learning agent is building up a detailed model of the environment and using that to plan, in our case, a tree search using A* through the environment to pick the optimal route. And then we have the successor representation reinforcement learning models that Kim Stackenfeld talked about and Caswell picked up on, which create, again, a representation of the structure of the environment, but combine that with values and cache that to allow a representation that's flexible for navigating. And it's proposed to be a good match to navigation. So what did we find? Well, here's the humans and rats, just first of all, to give you some trajectories that they perform pretty similar. Humans outperform the rats in our task. We did add a whole lot of fog into the environment, so humans found it much harder, but overall, humans tend to be sitting down to do a task, they are going to focus on it, whereas rats love pissing around and eating things and pooing and all sorts of things that we don't tend to find humans do in our lab experiments. So what we really want to report here is the log likelihood. So we're using a maximum likelihood to determine what the models are. And once we created those models and we found what the models best fit the biological data, we can then see how these compare. And we were really struck, or certainly Will, when he first extracted the data, to show that both rats and humans fit very similarly to the models, in the sense that the successor representation model really is doing a better job than the other two models at solving this maze problem. And we might have guessed that the model-based reinforcement learning agents might do a good job. Well, that was my hunch, that they can actually plan through the space and do a very sophisticated job. But actually, that doesn't do such a good job. Still better than the model-free learners. The model-free agents really do they look like incredibly dumb because they just don't update fast enough when the maze changes. But the model-free does update quite nicely, but perhaps too fast and lacks some of the errors that the rats and humans show. So that's one way of looking at the data, to say if we fit the parameters of the learning agents to humans and rats, their trajectory data, what do we see? That's one way of looking at it. Another way to look at the data is to take a number of metrics from the path. So if we say, here's a rat and it's trying to get to its goal, as it navigates there, and it might take a really bad or a good path, what's its the diffusivity, what's the kind of variation in the path, how much noise do you see in its turning around, how much tortuosity, what's the angular diffusivity. These are various metrics that you can capture for any trajectory through space. What we can do then is take that into a multi-dimensional space and say, okay, these are the metrics for these different rats and humans. Which of our reinforcement learning models have patterns that are most similar to these trajectory patterns that we're seeing? And in that context, what we can see, again, is that the model-free learner is the most dissimilar. So we're taking that multi-dimensional space and calculating the Mahalanobis distance from the models, how they perform, to the biological agents, the rats and the humans. And in both rats and humans, as I said, the model-free, it's just not performing in the same way. But for rats, we see, again, the successor representation is the best fit in terms of it shows the most similarity in the way its patterns are moving through the space to the rats. But for the humans, there's a sort of equivalency between the model-based and the successor representation. Our data can't distinguish them at that level. So from the path properties, humans have a greater match to both SR and the model-based agents, but rats have a much greater match to the SR agents. Well, at least you can see the data. It's not, that's the data there. And you can see individual lines for how individual humans and rats are showing very similar patterns within the data. So that's my talk. I hope you have been following, because I can't see anything other than my slides. But the take-home messages are, from the starting fMRI work, that hippocampal and paracampal activity is measured with fMRI appears to track distance and direction information about future goals. We've just reported that CL1 place cells do not seem to remap if the connectivity out of a space changes. If you can't go through a doorway, the maps don't change. Somewhere else outside CA1 seems to perhaps do some remapping. Our C-Hero Quest data is showing the age, the environment you grow up in, as in a rural or a city, and perhaps the culture impacts spatial navigation skill, we're looking at self-reports of how good people think they are, and that really taps into cultural elements of how good different people in different countries think that they're amazing or are very, very humble in some cultures. So we'll come back to that. We've shown today that London taxi drivers route planning, you can explain some of the choices and the planning, the speed at which they can plan different on a journey can be explained by network properties of the streets. We've shown that the successor representation reinforcement learning model appears to be the best match to rats and humans navigating in dynamic changing environments. And I'd finally like to just thank a whole range of people who've made it possible to report what I've just run through today, and a whole set of funders who've given bits of cash to make that actually possible. So hopefully that's worked and you are still all there. And I should unshare my screen, I guess. Oops. Come out.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. There's been an ongoing, very active chat going on. And while we are clapping and the claps are arriving, I just want to remind everyone that Hugo, together with Arne Ekstrom, Veronique Bobot, and Shayna Rosenbaum, they have this fantastic book called Human Spatial Navigation. And I will put a link after all the claps are done in the chat, because I think that it's a fantastic book. And in fact, Katja Hoffman, who's our next week's speaker, was singing the praise of the book the other day. And it was wonderful to see your work. And I think that I will reserve my questions to be last, because last time I think I went too much inside baseball too early, and John brought us back into asking questions. So I'm going to leave the questions first to John and Jovo.
Jovo, or do you?
I can start.
Go ahead.
So, Hugo, thanks. That was really fun and interesting. I didn't know hardly any of that stuff. So it was great to see. I learned a lot. So I guess my first question is, I really appreciate the last little bit of your thing where you're comparing rats and humans and then modeling them with the different approaches. And I think, this salon is about bridging biological and machine learning and intelligence. And that's a really beautiful example of essentially taking tools from AI and using them to help understand what's going on in biological learning. So I have a question about the other direction, which is the direction that most of my research really, which is, and I kind of asked it before, but I don't have a good sense. Are rats and humans good at navigating? And then, related, are the RL agents that we can build, not I can build, but like IDA or other people, are they better? And so do we have things to learn from rats and humans about how to build better navigational systems?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, the core question of what is good across species is a hard one, because, and indeed, I mentioned London, just to take an example, I mentioned London taxi drivers as humans are amazing because they can navigate 58,000 streets. It takes them 3 seconds. If you give them 2 places, they'll work out what the 30 streets they need to take, which is insane. But you could say, well, they're not much better than the Aboriginal people in the outback in parts of Australia who will never get lost and walk for days in a straight line. Very different experience. I think the same applies. You can look at that's within a species, but if you now start comparing rats and humans and across that, it's very hard to say who's better. And of course, in our experiment, we can keep titrating. And what we're trying to do in that experiment is make the humans worse and worse. We don't give any instructions, for example. They just have to guess what the hell they're supposed to do in that experiment. And they take ages, like an hour, to learn what to do there. So I think that answer to that question of it's hard to say who's better, who's good, but they certainly are. That both species are good. There are other species that are just insanely good at what they do in their niche. But your other question is really great. So if you think about what is it we might learn from looking at their patterns, how they might navigate, that would teach us something about building artificial agents. And I think the way I've been mulling over this is to go back to, say, DeepMind's, Caswell's fantastic paper with Andrea Bonino, where you've got an agent that's able to really do some quite impressive, from the readout from the screen, navigate. And these things beat humans at doing this in some way. So the machines seem to be possible to outcompete. But what I've been interested in is, can you predict when they'll go wrong? Can you predict where a human or a rat will screw up? And that's what I've become interested in, is because there's real utility in that. That we can see if you have an agent that will screw up in the right way, and you've managed to capture something that's more biological. Doesn't necessarily mean you've got the right, like the better AI, but you've understood something about the way we evolved, perhaps, to do this. And indeed, you can build better cities, right? Or better hospitals, because you can predict screw-ups. You've got artificial agents now. You don't need to test it on. You can test it with your agents, and they will get lost in the ways that humans will get lost. So that's that's a really useful thing, I think, potentially, about trying to understand better the mistakes. My impression of a lot of the literature is people are really obsessed with kind of, can we benchmark, can we outcompete, who's the best Atari player in the world, and that the AI can do better than the best Atari player. But can the AI like suck badly as the average person does at that game, and in what way? So I think that's another aspect of that. But yeah, there's a lot we can learn. Yeah.
So is it fair to summarize your answer as this research is mostly kind of unidirectional? We're leveraging AI to understand biology, but there's not a lot going the other direction.
I guess I'd like to see it both ways. You'd hope that you would see patterns in data where, I mean, a good example is that our rats and humans were outperforming our RL agents in many cases. So what is it they were able to do? And I think looking at this work, we realized that momentum, if you're moving around a space, you have momentum, and that affects you. You're biased to keep going. If you want to suddenly halt and go 180 degrees behind you, that's has a big cost, and we tend to be focused in our representations forwards, at least as humans. And so those kind of things often get missed out when you're thinking about models. So why is it that the agents might miss that? So I don't know. Certainly both ways is good, but I have been mainly focusing on thinking, how can we understand this? And maybe I didn't make super clear, is that one good criticism, Brad Love wrote an article in the same edition of the current opinion in behavioral sciences that Ida wrote. Brad Love commented and said, oh, it's terrible, these studies, you just correlate one metric like distance against the brain, because what does it really tell you? I mean, I think it's telling us something, but it doesn't tell you that's the model, that's what the brain is representing, right? It just shows you that that part of the brain is doing something that's sensitive to distance. Why? What is it that the distance is telling us? And so I'm hoping with this approach, you're getting a bit deeper, as in what are the metrics that are changing with distance? And so some of Ida's papers and others have certainly been really insightful for thinking about that.
Cool, thanks. And then, I'm glad you mentioned that thing about Brad Love articles in terms of the limitations of correlations, because you said there's a few slides. I'm going to push back a little bit in some of your slides. I think maybe your summary slide, I think it said, growing up in a city has a negative impact on navigation ability, which is actually, as I understand it, a relatively strong
you're right.
causal
I should
claim.
be careful about that. Yep.
And there was an observational study. And so, this is pretty common in neuroscience. And I think your data make a really compelling case that one should do this proper causal study where we check whether that is in fact the case. And so you have really cool evidence supporting that there's a correlation there.
No, you're absolutely right. I did phrase that badly in the instance.
Can I follow up on that in a different direction? So I typically see more folks who are not used to big cities get lost in big cities than big city folks get lost in the suburbs. That's why I wonder whether you could the C-Quest, the C-Hero Quest, maybe because of the fact that it didn't have a lot of landmarks, or the complexity wasn't the same as maybe big cities. Maybe it's a little bit. I don't know. You see where I'm going with my question, because just like anecdotally, I'm a little confused because of that.
No, absolutely, you're right. So C-Hero Quest does have a lot of some of the levels. The one I showed, for example, is pretty landmark low, but some of them are extremely rich. There's loads of landmarks, So we also, part of it, Veronique Bobot, who's one of the co-authors on the book we mentioned, she designed a radial, so most of the game is sort of new paradigms, but we took her tasks. She spent years working on this radial maze. But obviously, David Olson developed many in the 60s, but she's been working in virtual reality for a while. And in that, we're able to see people who use landmarks, so explicitly show a strategy that or report using them, that they're not better navigators in general. So we're able to sort of delve into those topics with it. But you're right about the city aspect. That why is it? What is it exactly that's going on there? And my impression, I think in an update we release, we've been looking to see what is it that happens if you simulate trajectories through cities, and not just any city, through these cities. What is it that co-varies? And it really is that you're only taking very much right-angle turns. You're not experiencing the space in a fully diverse direction. You're not having that exposure if you're just growing up in a really gritty city. So it's not cities in general that are having a bad effect. So if it really does seem to be, the data suggests, as we just heard, like it's a correlation and it's something I need to follow up, but it's pretty suggestive. And there's a lot more factors to delve into here. But yeah, I was really struck when we went into the data. So can you predict these effects inside the game data? So it's not just, oh, cities are bad, but actually gritty cities are particularly bad, and they have a particular impact on certain levels in the game, not just general navigation performance. So another way, just to end on that rather than thinking about that cities are bad, is to think that maybe we adapt to the environments we're growing up in. So if you grow up in a more rural suburb environment, there's just more diversity of space, and so you're good at that. Whereas we're finding this hint that people who are growing up in gritty cities are actually more efficient navigators. Not a strong effect, but there's a hint that they're actually doing better on average in gritty levels in the game. So it's not they're bad necessarily. I've said on average they're bad. That is true in our task, but actually it may be more of an adaptation. And of course, the experiment to run would be mice or rats growing up in really different environments and seeing what impact that has on their grid cells and how they navigate. Would be a really great way to follow this up if someone has a huge grant waiting to go.
I guess the experiment that I would have thought was, so the common encounter that you see in a lot of books and in a lot of movies too is that a small town person goes to a big city and gets lost. The opposite usually doesn't happen, that a big city person goes to the suburbs and get lost. Or at least I haven't heard of it as much. So I think that's where I was thinking about
that's great.
Navigating cities might be a specialized thing. So whether if you put people in the scanner to, like the study that they did in Toronto that Eva and I reanalyzed the data, where they had people in the scanner navigating in the virtual Toronto in the street view. If you did that to people who were from other big cities versus people who were from small towns, I guess the prediction there is that people from big cities might have done it better. So what I'm trying to say is that navigating big cities might be its own beast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we'd be curious to find out, which we'd like to chase up and find out how this really ties into GPS use. So some people, and I remember meeting a woman in a coffee shop where she couldn't leave the coffee shop because she'd lost the charger to her iPhone. Without her iPhone, she couldn't meet a friend, no idea how to get to them. So there are those costs of offloading onto technology when it fails that may well, that if you were traveling in a vast rural space, I doubt you would take that risk. You wouldn't end up in a coffee shop or some mountain in the middle of nowhere, or hopefully you wouldn't. Just see Steve's had to go because it's good.
Yeah, I think that was the end of my question. So thanks.
So I have to tell you, I'm a bit confused. And, we had a lovely talk from Caswell, and, we've heard a lot, I've heard a lot and read from Ida, and, this very beautiful relationship between grid cells and place cells, and the way that the mathematics of the successive representation maps onto the properties of grid cells and place cells. So it's very educational to see how the anatomy of this entorhinal hippocampal relationship actually beautifully is recapitulated in a sort of graph mathematics that is conducive to solving that dynamic remapping task that you discussed by a successor representation, right? It's very nice. Great. But that just seems a universe away from taking a look at a map and going, oh, yes, that's a left turn, that's a right turn, I have to memorize it. Or the taxi driver case where they had to plan, where you sort of, in my view, go, well, they have 58,000 options. No, they don't. They basically, presumably, visualize almost map-like that bit of London, rather like what you show in your game, and they massively dimensionally reduce before they actually go and do that. So in other words, unless you say otherwise, it just seems to me that they're complete apples and oranges. The way that somebody can memorize a map and then do it, and then sort of maybe track relative to its template that they keep in their head, right? Versus the taxi driver did. I mean, no rat's going to go, okay, you know, I mean, so in other words, so my question comes in two parts. They seem completely qualitatively different to me, A. B, I accept that there are situations where humans will use a successor representation like situation. I feel like I do that in hotels. I've mentioned this on this show before. It feels very successor representation to me when I try and find my way back via a different staircase to my hotel room, right? And if I'm wrong, then I'd like you to tell me how it is going from sort of, you know, dead reckoning in an ant to a sort of model-free way of doing it, to a latent learning, which you get the state transitions and then you can do successor representation, all the way to memorizing maps and being a taxi driver planning. I mean, I just find it extremely hard to believe that those are all versions of each other, right? It just seems like they're different, right? So could you tell me why I should be convinced that they're all versions of each other and hippocampal dependent?
Yeah, great question. Okay, I think I can tie why some of this would be hippocampal dependent, but I would start by saying it's a great point. I like people going, "What? This is just madness." So yeah, absolutely, I wanted to present here a sort of smorgasbord of like different things we've been doing because I'm quite interested in seeing this from different perspectives of thinking about this is navigate. How do people navigate? And we'll come at it from lots of different angles. And that doesn't mean they match up, right? They don't have to actually completely intersect and you build something perfect at that point. Ideally, at the end.
But you imply it. You see,
I do, because eventually you do, right?
I feel that one shouldn't do that. I don't feel one should do that. I feel one should.
John, let him answer. John, let him answer.
No, it's good. I interrupt people too much as well. So it's good. It's good. So yeah, I think ultimately this would all integrate together, but at the current time we're quite very far away from that. But I think too often the experimental work just sits in one of these boxes and we don't get it out and think, wait a second, how does this? So I think to answer your question, well, how do these all relate? Why does this relate to the hippocampus? Is that the way I conceived of this is whenever the system needs to extract out where am I in this space in terms of some self-localization, I'm in this particular part of space, and retrieve from a memory, as in it's not just something I can see across the room, and integrate those 2 points and have to pass through the environment to get there. That seems to be what a lot of people would argue is hippocampally dependent navigation. So you can't just simply retrieve some stored, oh, this feels right. So you have to actually calculate that. So all of the work I've just talked about, the taxi drivers have to, like you just said, they have to sort of pinpoint, retrieve a memory of where is this. I think that is relying on similar systems to our rats having to go across the maze in some way. But my goodness, there's an insane amount of extra levels on there. And I don't think we should just discard those extra levels because it's too complicated. Rather try and think about what are each of these things telling us. And they're telling us about experience, particularly human experience for taxi drivers. But for rats, it's, each of the times we do these different experiments, we see different things. And integrating them is really hard. So the review I've got coming out with Zeta Pati on prefrontal cortex has been a real challenge to think, how the hell do we integrate all this for navigation? And there we're thinking about all those aspects of navigation that normally don't come up in rat studies because we don't push rats through really complicated scenarios. But I think we've seen them do quite impressive things. I've seen other studies. It's just painful to train them to do things.
But
you certainly, yeah.
I appreciate that, but I just feel like there's this that you can end up shepherding your hypothesis so much to find integration prematurely that you don't want to end up saying, well, yes, you have to track body position in all those very different cases. But I could say that with the exception of maybe the taxi drivers, you need to use your legs in all those different tasks. And therefore, the leg is the common integrating idea. So in other words, what I worry about is that maybe even in the case where you have to remember the map in your game and then go, that you have to use some system to tell you where you are positionally in that template you've remembered. I can see that. But the interesting part, which is the ability to have this whole shape of the map in your head and hold it there, is many, as you said, levels up this tracking of position, which is the lowest common denominator. But it just feels to me that the real differences are what are interesting, and you're just ramming us to the lowest common denominator. And that's what I want.
Yeah, so wait. I need to interrupt, because the success representation is not about tracking where you are. It is that memory.
I was just talking about, I'm just talking about, we just heard that your position has to be tracked to space. I didn't talk about this because that's a representation just then. So I'm just saying, I'm just asking, let me finish, Ida. I'm just asking what it is that you think is the extra bit that is going on in the two most interesting cases, where the taxi driver literally has to think in their head, okay, this is London, this is this, or in your game case where you show a whole map and then they memorize it before they get going and start using their place cells, right?
Yeah.
What are they doing?
Great. That's great. I think we don't know enough actually about that. So how do you take a map that you've seen and translate that into a representation in your head? If you've never been in the space, and actually I haven't seen fantastic data on that. Somebody does need to look at that. The taxi driver case is a bit different, I think, where, it's another whole kettle of fish. But I think
isn't that the extra piece that is amazing, that we all are so impressed by the knowledge? So I'm just saying, it seems to me that the really bizarre bit, whether it's memorizing the map or what the taxi drivers are doing, seems to be qualitatively floating on top of what's common. And that's what I'm sort of asking you, is that true, or is it, which is which?
I think yes and no. I think Ida's saying no. There is. I think Ida's. So actually, if you go back to that slide, the taxi driver, you couldn't hear his voice. It's a shame. It was a really rough, classic London accent. But he's very quick. There's certain streets where you can't tell. So the idea of going back is there's something stored and cached in his representation of those street networks that means he can read out that bit of space extremely efficiently. And the question is why? Why is that? And that may well go back to models that he's developed. His representation of the space is compressed in some way in a chunk. And I think that does have relationship to reinforcement learning models and ways of thinking about partitioning space for efficient planning. So we've got a long way to go with that data. We haven't really analyzed the data at the level of what is it in the space that relates to existing planning models, which we will be doing. But you're right, there's an element level on top of the visual imagery that humans can have, and whether that relates to whether rats have that. Some people argue that that one of the main reasons the hippocampus is involved in things is the scene construction. So the idea that it builds you can build a mental model in your head, and it's not actually a memory system. It's just all the studies, whenever you've had to look at hippocampal patients, or they all tap into scene construction, and it's not even it's not so much of a memory system. So the argument there would be that's why the storage of this mental image would be there. But I find that it's an interesting angle, but I think this is hard to relate to rats. And I do think there's a lot of similarity in the way our hippocampus and rats' hippocampus is structured. So there are bits on top, and the language, of course, of like the street names and the images of the maps isn't something that other species have, right? As far as we know. So those are the sort of extra bits. And we do have a lot of different specialized prefrontal regions that rats lack. So there are other aspects in terms of what may be possible to plan and hold in mind and sequentially plan in the way that we don't. But yeah, I'm not claiming that all this work nicely fits. I think I'm taking a very different approach of prodding different bits of the system and saying, hey, what happens here if you look at this part? Can we understand this? They do all interrelate in that they all relate to somebody going from A to B. They have to think. It's not a sort of overlearned route. Somebody's having to solve that problem from memory. That's the interlinked similarity. But you're right. Like if you just go, oh, well, the C Hero Quest stuff relates to the rat running around a maze. It doesn't. So yeah, you're right to push back if it came across like that. That was not my intention. But I think we do need to try and build a better framework going forward. But
I mean, there's just my last point. There's always a tension, right, which I greatly appreciate between, you know, what we've talked about a lot on this salon, between sort of really fruitful lumping in order to begin to find overlap that's fruitful versus premature lumping where one can make it seem as though there's more commonality because navigation is a word that can be used in so many scenarios that it becomes a false compressed friend, right? And I just think that it's just fascinating, you know, and it's come up a lot in this salon with, can you find qualitatively different ways to solve the navigation problem? Or do you come up with a common way to solve the navigation problem? And when you have a structure that seems to be important across tasks like the hippocampus, it can lead to the idea, perhaps justified to a degree, that there must be a commonality because there's an anatomy that's shared. But it could also be that that anatomy gets used in qualitatively different ways when it's inserted in with other parts of the brain, right? So in other words, it's just that interesting tension between going for commonalities because of certain circumstantial facts like the hippocampus is involved versus saying, well, is it possible that different creatures have come up with quite different ways to solve the navigation problem? And how do we break that tie, basically?
Well, I think one thing we've not done yet, which would be very interesting, would be to compare in a similar task like this, if possible, to insects. And what are they doing? Are they much more like a model-free based learner? Do they just fail in the way you'd predict from other models? And that may be just a step beyond. But I think there's a sense here where you can start to take wildly different species and put them through something that challenges them. And a problem for me has been that the humans just solve some of these things too quickly or too boring for humans. But here we've tried to build something that's a bit more of a challenge for all species. And indeed, some of the mazes I pointed out, there were 3 particular mazes that humans suck at. They're really bad, but rats are good. And that tends to be when the rat's able to run over the space over a wider area. Humans are really not great in our task at doing that. So it's not all humans are fantastic and rats are bad. But if we were to compare to yet more species, we might. But I'm not saying that's a panacea or fantastic. It's just there's a potential there to start doing that. Where I think for years, I mean, it's really been quite depressing in a way, as a sort of ham-wavy connection, like I did in some ways at the beginning. We've used fMRI to look at how connections are represented. Suddenly, we're using place cells, and there's a huge difference. So much of the bold signal we might see in the hippocampus in humans may have absolutely nothing to do with the activity of place cells. It could be entirely to do with network properties that are not tied to the way the cells express fields. We just don't know. But I still think there's value in thinking about what do we learn from these different methods? How do they integrate? The tasks are different, I admit. And so I think that's what we've been trying to do, is to come to some approach that might bring us together. Hopefully that answers that question. But yeah, this is a great point. There's tension there for sure. I'm quite happy with it.
It's already 20 past 5 for us, and I guess later for you guys. And so I'm going to ask very quick questions so that we can go to the questions from the audience. Jovid, in the meantime, while I'm asking, could you please invite Melanie and Hillary, which are our most voted questions. So first, I'm going to ask a kind of wow, John disappeared. What happened? Did John do a mic drop?
I think he got upstaged by Melanie and Hillary.
So is the data available for others to analyze also? Is the data somewhere?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do have the data available, and we're very happy to share it. We're still trying to, so we do have access. If somebody would like the data, we'll make it available to them. It's not been set up directly for an easy download at the moment. We've been really fighting with that. It hasn't been trivial with that data, but hopefully we can agree soon with the journal that will host it. I'd also highlight that if anyone would like to use the app we've developed, it's not available in the App Store anymore. We took it down. It's completely anonymized on there, but we have an ID version that people could use if they wanted to run a study, or just play with the app if they're interested in it for themselves for doing something. But yeah, we've got lots of collaborations going on, and be happy to collaborate with other people to help their science. So yeah.
And the other question is, how did you analyze the sort of 3 million data? Because it's like there's a lot of challenges in, even managing studies that have 1,000 subjects. So how did you manage? What is the tools that you use for analyzing 3 million data points?
Yeah, linear models and linear mixed models. I mean, you need some reasonable computing power, but it's not like this is trajectory data, so you can get down to one metric per person for what's their score. So you can score people off, extract out a navigation score, and then you are looking at that data. And a lot of the work is you've got 3.9 million people, but you want to be extremely data cautious. You cut out all sorts of, like we excluded everyone who said they were 18 because it's the lowest age. We don't know if that's lots of 4-year-olds putting their, I mean, I remember Tim Barron saying, yeah, sorry, but my 4-year-olds have run off my phone. They've entered data into your game. I'm sorry, I've destroyed you. And I said, okay, I think we've got enough other bits of data. So there's a lot of working on sort of removing bias in there. In our first paper in supplemental, there's a lot of work to try and understand bias.
The last thing that I wanted to ask is, I know that although it didn't make it to the paper, as far as I know, the SR plus replay, SR Dyna, performed better than SR originally on the data. So I wonder whether in the situation, there was only one plot where it seemed like SR and MB are performing equally. I wonder whether if you had SR Dyna, it would have been more performing better.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the discussion around this. We had a little Twitter chat with Will, and I think his issue with that was that it was hard to make sure it was a fair comparison, was what he was arguing when he looked over the data. So it certainly outcompeted. So the Dyna version absolutely did a better job, but that might be like inherently in that process, it's able to do more, and so we'll look at trying to get that. It certainly needs to be discussed in the manuscript in that preprint.
Oh, that's okay if it doesn't. But the fairness would be
if there was
the classic Dyna versus the SR Dyna, right? Then it would be fair in that regard. The prediction would be that the classic Dyna would perform between model-based and model-free, whereas the SR Dyna would perform even better than the SR. So that's like the kind of...
That's a great point. Yeah, we'll definitely go back and look at that. Thanks, Ida. That's really good.
It's really not a point for the paper. It's
no, I think that's a great comment. Oh, I agree with it, yeah.
So, hi, Hillary, you had the highest voted question. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, for sure. So I was just wondering how you can make such strong sort of statements on, say, oh, like age is making people worse at video games, because it seems like the only way you can truly tease out age relationships is by tracking people's skills over time, since inevitably age will always be related to different environmental upbringings. Yeah.
That's great. I think that's a challenge in giving a short talk like this is not to have time to go into some of the qualifications. That it's hopefully the Salon will get through some of those. So your question, am I right, is saying where it's a snapshot of points over time. We're not taking someone and looking how they age and seeing do they get worse over their lifetime. So you can't say from that. That's absolutely true. It's not a longitudinal study, and it will be nice to do that. The longest we've done is 2 years to show what happens in 2 years, but that's not enough here.
Yeah, I'm thinking like, yeah, old people and young people. I mean, young people play a lot of video games and were raised on computers.
That's absolutely true. That's I saw that in the chat question. That's a really, really good point. So one of the nice features of C Hero Quest is that the tutorial levels, you go into the game and you have to figure out how to use the controls. And that gives us two things. It gives us a really good metric of how good people are at video games, because if you're good at video games, or maybe you've not played video games, but you're inherently amazing at them by just happens to be your skill, we'll capture that in that. And we included that as a metric in our analysis. So all that analysis of how different countries perform equates for that. It turned out in our early analysis, it's all in this vast amount of supplemental, But it turned out that the UK had the best video game skill in the world. We just suck at navigation comparatively to the US or other countries like Canada. Video game skill did not relate to GDP, which is quite interesting, I thought. And we found with See Here Request, we wanted to test, does it relate? So the question you were is, does it actually relate to real world navigation? And in a paper we published, we showed in I think it was like 35 people in London, and then we did the entire experiment again in Paris with a new group of Parisians. We looked at, could it predict their wayfinding in Paris and London under new routes, like having to do the same thing. You see a map and it does a great job. It's pretty good at predicting real world navigation, but not the video games levels. They don't tell you anything. Someone's good at video games. I can't say anything about how well you'll find your way in Paris or London. But if you play See a Request and give me your scores with some extra analysis, I can predict how well you will. And that, we haven't published it, but we've also found that extends to older people who are between the age of 60, 75. So we're trying to do a lot of work on assessing those topics, but it doesn't seem like video game skill is what's causing this decline. And the bigger question is, who are the best navigators? Nora Newcomb told me she thinks 12 might be the peak for human navigation skill. So most of us here are on a still, but I'm skeptical, I must admit.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
So Ida's just past her prime, according to John in his Facebook descriptions.
Melanie.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Great, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for this great talk. This is fascinating. So my question is about different kinds of strategies for navigation. So I don't know that much about this topic, but it does seem that anecdotally, people use very different kinds of strategies. And I know that there's always, like, my husband and I always fight about this because he always, when he's giving directions, he says, well, you go up the hill and then you take a turn at that big dogwood tree and then, you go around the curve. And I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. What's the name of the street? And it's just, even when following a map, I look at the names of the streets, and other people kind of look at sort of the pattern of streets. And I'm wondering if you looked into that difference of strategies of people, and with respect to their abilities of navigation, and also with their respect to like brain dynamics, if you can differentiate that. And I don't even know if you can do that in people or in rats or what have you. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really important, again, for the short talk for the Salon, I really skipped over that completely, but it is a big topic. So when you're trying to explain how good is somebody at navigating, it does matter what context they're navigating in, but like you've just picked up, it matters what strategies they're using and what their personal preferences are. So there've been a number of ways to look at that. I mentioned Veronique Bobot earlier, who's the co-author on the book we wrote. And I said she's been studying this for some time, and in the sense you can find people who like memorizing turns, the number of turns they need to take, or that latch onto landmarks, the two big dissociations. You can see the same sort of things in rats and in humans. And she's produced papers suggesting different activity patterns emerge from these different strategies, and different correlates in terms of brain structure are related to them. And that's one way of thinking about it. What we've tapped into in the last few years is a questionnaire that Morris Moscovich developed, his team. Jessica Robin, I think, is the lead author on that development, where it's a questionnaire about navigation strategies. And the big distinction they found was between people who like thinking about maps and thinking about spaces from that sort of map perspective versus route-oriented people with scenes. And what we found is that people who report using maps in their heads more, they scale on, there's a whole questionnaire, they tend to activate their hippocampus more in relation to distance in navigation in our studies. But that's just one other. There's also evidence of differences in the structure of the hippocampus based on this. So there's bits of evidence, but I think it's not like a piece of work where we firmed up and we're absolutely clear this is what happens when you have, and these are the definite strategies. And that is a challenge, because it goes back to the discussions we've been having already about how all these things can integrate. If you're studying navigation in the Sahara versus London versus a jungle, the different strategies need to be different. So hopefully that answers the question. But yeah, people are really interested in the strategies, and there's still a lot of work to do to really pull it out. From our data, with See Here Request, all we've got is whether they use landmarks or not, and we didn't find a big difference. It didn't seem to help in our mass data to see landmark users aren't better. But there are interesting patterns over the lifespan for these people. But yeah, we're waiting to publish that work. Hopefully we'll get it out soon. Thank you for the question.
Is there anything known about like gender differences in terms of the strategies that are used?
Yeah, it's been argued that there's review papers going back 20 years ago now that rats and humans, female rats tend to rely more on landmarks than male rats and male humans. But the extent to which that's all played out I'm not sure how strong that data is currently, but there was certainly a narrative that there's a greater reliance on landmarks and they showed this by, for example, rats navigating or humans navigating, take away the landmarks and the male rats and male humans carry on performing well, whereas the females wouldn't. But again, counting for video games experience is a question from Hillary earlier. Whether they counted for that is not clear to me. And you saw from my data today that the culture you're being brought up is going to have some impact. So I think some of these effects we've seen in terms of gender differences may be diminishing actually over time as more people engage in video games like this and so on.
Just one more quick question. On the London taxi drivers, is there any data on male versus females performance on the test?
Yeah, that is a nice question. It's extremely hard to recruit female taxi drivers, but it would be something we'd like to do. I doubt there would be any difference in the test between them. It's just very hard. I think we tested 2 female taxi drivers in the 3 years we were trying to study taxi drivers. They're hard to kind of corral and get them to do things. So, but it is something you'd like to know. I wouldn't expect it to be a difference. Age was interesting. So we looked at taxi drivers in their 70s. They can drive into their 80s or 90s if they pass the license. And there's no decline in speed. They can call out a route with absolute efficiency in their 70s. So there's something about expertise that doesn't get wiped in the same way we saw in our See Here Request data. Thanks for the great questions.
Great, thank you.
So we have next.
Thanks, Hillary. Thanks,
are you inviting Brad Needy next? Okay, but
yeah.
So then wait. I think I need to turn on the light at some point. It's so gray here. It's not dark. It's completely gray. Yeah, it's snowing.
So nice.
Hi, Brad.
Hello.
Hi, Needy.
Hi, Brad.
Brad.
There we go.
Hi.
Hi. So that was a wonderful talk. It's really thought-provoking, of course. I'm more of a psychologist these days than a neuroscientist, and so when I see the discussion here of sort of measuring navigational navigational ability, this I guess sort of goes to what John was asking about, which is how do you sort of think about operationalizing this as a sort of fundamental construct? And a sort of related question then I guess is when you design this task, you seem to have built in a very important memory component, which is that their ability to rapidly form a memory of that map would probably have a huge impact, right, on their ability to get through it. Is there a way that you can discount the memory component as a source of driver variance? And I think of that especially when I see like an age-related decline, right? Like the first thing that jumps out at me is that this is probably related to memory formation, perhaps.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. So it was a real massive challenge trying to work out what tasks you could embed in an engaging video game, and we just spent a lot of time with the games designers getting stuff ruled out because it was just too boring. So I think that is one of the reasons we ended up with this. It's not something I'd done before of showing a map, but it worked for what we needed to do. But you're right, it does have a big memory loading in terms of storing. So it's very much an executive task. If you're a neuropsychologist, you look at what we've done and go, wow, that's an executive attention task. And that's just the way it was possible to test this. But there are a few things we can look at. So some of the maps is just nothing. So you can't really gain anything from the maps in the game. So we've been looking at whether that some people do better when there's no map, or like you can sort of track, because you've got so many people, you can track a whole bunch of people that are behaving similarly. Suddenly they get no map. And who are the people that suffer when the map is gone? We also have levels in it where people have to just find their way down a river, pick up a flare gun and shoot it back to the start. So we've been able to look at that. That's tapping into the ability to path integrate and seeing how that's related. So that doesn't have that memory loading of looking at a map and is more akin to what rats might do in terms of orienting in space. And that shows very similar patterns to the main task in terms of, we also see people who grew up in gritty cities are worse at that task than non-gritty city people. But I'm not sure I fully answered your question. You're sort of maybe I've gone off onto sort of thinking about can we get beyond.
Yeah, I guess again, going sort of back to what John was saying, right? Can you imagine if you had to describe in like a few sentences, what is the sort of key operational cognitive operation that would define navigation? Like, so, I mean,
yeah,
it's probably more than just like knowing where you are. There's got to be, I would imagine, something else in addition to that. That's
right. So I did try and preface at the outset to say if you're trying to go from A to B, there's quite a repertoire of different systems and in the brain that you might use to do that. It's not a simple thing at all. And in particular, so much of our navigation, I actually assume a lot of my navigation is based on the striatum, that I'm not having to rely on. If you were to remove my hippocampus, I would still functionally behave. A lot of work with amnesics suggests that. So actually defining and saying, what is it in navigation that I think is the fundamental thing is actually really it's not one sentence, actually is quite big. What is fundamental here, you can say, is the operation is getting from one point in space to another. And in my case, it's one point in space to another in an environment you've only recently encountered. So you haven't been there extensively and you haven't taken that route overly. And you're having to remember where this point is. It's not somewhere that you can just see, or that there's a big flag or a tower there to go, that's it, that's where I go. And so if you take those two things together, that's the kind of scenario that I'm looking at. And that's why I think, based on what we know about the neural systems, the idea that you've got this self-localization within the hippocampus, and we've seen more and more data to suggest those representations of goal positions are being captured within that, in the dynamics. That seems to be what is going on here in terms of trying to summarize what's exciting and why I'm interested in that, because that's more the deliberative side of navigation. I think, how do I get there? That kind of process, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that fully summarizes it, but to really answer that question, you need to lay out the kind of whole space of different scenarios and systems, and indeed go back to that strategy problem. So it is actually quite a complicated problem. It's not like we can say, how do you move your hand? And even that's hard, but navigation actually is really diverse depending on who, where, what background they have, etc. Sorry to put a downer on it.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing though. It's I think one approach is to make some minimal assumptions and build some models and see if other things emerge out of them that you didn't operationalize in them. And then another approach is to top down, sit down and write a huge list of all the possible operations and implement them by hand, right? I think that the second approach is a little more good old-fashioned AI. Like it's a little bit more like, I'm going to bake in everything. I first create an exhaustive list with words, and then have everybody agree on these words, and then we'll implement them. The other option says, I'll just figure out what's the minimal math that's required. I'll build one model, I'll build another model, then compare them. When it fits behavior, then I look inside, then I look at the brain. Then let me see, does this model give rise to this? Oh, wait a second, this model emerged, something else emerged out of it. Does this prediction hold? I feel like there is something in between that we are doing, which is a little bit closer to a lot of the things that we didn't even bake in these models emerge out of it, which I think has been the satisfying thing about them. And it doesn't mean that it's the best thing. I was saying this last time. The best achievement I can have in my life is to make my own models obsolete and propose the next good thing, right? So I think that that's like the aspiration. And if a colleague does, great, but if I do it, even better. For me, the I was so shocked at things working out. I sat on the success representation data and did like replications and reanalysis and like get another batch of subjects, etc. for years. I couldn't believe that like you finally made it work. And then once we submitted it, I was sure. I was like, all right, I can, it's a bridge I will sleep under and it's not going to fall on me. And then when Hugo's work came out, I was very excited because his task was not as carefully controlled design as mine. Mine was very controlled to compare to conditions. His task was not. It was in rodents and then comparable in humans. Mine was just in humans for a particular data, and it didn't really involve navigation. It was decision making. His task was entirely navigation, right? So that was like a further kind of validation. When Tim's paper came out, it was nice. Like I would have guessed, like we have claimed that this would be the case also in associative memory, but we weren't sure. So like there is a lot of things that I think that some kind of math, when it works out or models, it some other things emerges out of it that it wasn't operationalized or baked in it first. But you're right that there could be other things, and we could think one of the things that we do for designing architectures is how to add different architectures together in a modular way to do more. For instance, currently we're looking at can an agent explain its path, say what it's doing? Can an agent explain its policy to a human? Like, hey, I took the left and then took the right turn, right? Our agents in the game that we are training, they see a map of the environment and navigate the environment. So they actually are seeing a top-down map so they have to also use that, learn how to translate the top-down map to a first-person navigation. So I think that there are adjacent things, and then the architecture becomes a little more complex, the same way that you might have like a visual cortex or a motor cortex or whatnot added. Also in the navigation modules, you might have the link with the language side, or the one that reads the map and the one that does the navigation. But I think that the work that Hugo showed, all of his work that shows this fundamental navigation part of the hippocampus, I think that actually, no matter how modular you make a more sophisticated architecture, that part might actually still be in whatever that final architecture is. And if we find a better model for it, that would be awesome. If we can make this model obsolete and find better things, that's a great day for me if I do it in my own lifetime. At some point we should accept there is a core operation that like is being done that seems like it might survive at least for a while, or it has survived for a while, right? But I totally agree with you that there are all these other modules, and some of the operations might actually be in modules outside of it even.
So that I agree with all of that, and it really got me thinking about, in terms of like a fundamental module that we could express or explore in different ways. Hugo, do you think that what you would define as navigation would extend to like three-dimensional or more dimensional spaces or non-metric spaces? Like, does it sort of expand outwards into like a wider range of spaces?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I didn't really catch on that in my talk at all, but obviously, and Caswell picked up that last week, and Kim, that really we can start thinking about these systems as being more diverse for not just physical space, but networks of any feature where you can map that. There's a lot of evidence now that seems to be the case. I wrote a TIX article last year, very short commentary on one of these papers looking at word lists and how you could see mapping in the multi-dimensional space of words, and you can see theta tracking the further the distance in the multi-dimensional word space, the greater the bound, the increase in the hippocampal theta. It's a really nice study, but it really got me thinking, wait a second, do we think these are literally the same thing? And they were finding it was more dominant in the left hemisphere, where we don't tend to see the navigation correlates in the same way, where you tend to see language correlates. So I started thinking perhaps there is some system, and probably there are multiple maps that interact, but I don't think it's one universal map, was my argument. Whereas I can see Tim Behrens and others have sort of argued it's just a system, right? It maps anything you want. It's completely universal. And I suspect because of the way the anatomy is set up and there are different inputs, it's not totally universal in humans. But a lot of this goes back to John O'Keefe and Lynn Nadell. Chapter 13 of their book, they go on to deep structure in language, and they got a hard time from Steve Pinker in a commentary a while back when they wrote about this stuff. And but they've been arguing for this, emotions and all sorts of things might be represented by the hippocampus. So it's a long history, but and we've got some work. We've been looking at how might people represent networks of non-spatial stimuli, but we just haven't got it pulled together yet. But we will do hopefully soon. I need to get that manuscript sorted out.
It's Hugo. It's remarkably similar to me to what happened with the cerebellum, right? So here's we've got a structure that is even more uniform. Since the 60s, people have thought that there must be a universal computation for the cerebellum. And it was started out in motor. So motor would be navigation, let's say, for the hippocampus. And the attempt to find a universal computation for the cerebellum has been a complete and utter failure, right? We still haven't the slightest idea what it's doing with all its connections to prefrontal cortex, premotor cortex. So it's kind of interesting. There may be a universal cerebellar computation, right? It's just very interesting, again, at a meta level, to wonder whether one should take the sort of view that you're taking between the left and the right versus, Tim, that there's this universal computation that the structure supports, and all you really need to do is worry about the inputs and outputs. And I wonder whether, again, to my question and to Brad's, whether when you embed this piece of architecture in all the other modules, it qualitatively changes what it does, right? And that's possible, right?
Yeah, I think that is. That's a question for Brad, but yeah, I mean, if you think about space and time, there are time cells and place cells, and you can see when the task demands more time focus, you might get more time cells. So there's there might be a sort of a universal system in some ways that could be drawn upon that has different anatomical inputs to it, but depending on what you need to do and what that task for that sort of thing you're looking at mapping, let's say social networks, there's something about that draws on some aspects of that mapping system that are different to mapping how far away people are in physical space. So it's the same system, but you're pulling it in different directions and you're giving it different inputs. But there may be some fundamental, just looking at the anatomy, that's always a good place to start. What do these things actually look like? It's remarkably conserved, I would say.
Oh, no, I mean, it's been the story. I mean, basal ganglia, cerebellum, it's so conserved, going all the way back to worms that one would look for universal computation. And I think it's a very laudable project. Just one thing on that to you is, are you using navigation as a task to look at something more universal? Or are you interested in navigation per se in all the ways that it might play out? So are you a universal hippocampal computation person, or are you navigation is just a fascinating challenge that comes in taxi driver flavors and maze flavors, and you're interested in navigation per se?
Okay, and I think that is great. So hopefully that did come across in my talk that I am more interested in the latter, and that is interesting to come into the salon and thinking about a general question about if we were trying to generate a general artificial intelligence or something, that it might be discussable. Like, what's the value in this kind of playing with this thing on the corner there? So I am interested in both, but a lot of what I've been doing is prodding that and playing with what are the scenarios, what are the things that are interesting when you look at that problem of getting from A to B. I think you're right. I think you picked up on something quite nice, that we call this thing navigation. We'll study navigation, but actually so complicated, particularly if you start thinking about wordless learning now. So I'm going to memorize you 10 words, later ask you to remember them, and we'll study that as a navigational system because you're looking at the mapping of movement in a 3D, in a 14-dimensional word space, that it's cognitive maps and all these. Cognitive maps have done a lot of work in the last 2 or 3 years, I would say. So I think all these things are interesting, but I've been fundamentally more interested in the navigation side of it. Well, how is it that we navigate? What is it we need to understand to really get to that? And I think so much of what we've looked at with rodents has been, how do we represent running around in boxes? I mean, that's been a really, the last article I remember Howard Eichenbaum wrote was a complaint about this, basically. I can't remember which journal it's in. He just said, this has really annoyed me all my career, just so much work on just boxes. But the reason is, it's so beautiful. You can really understand in a nice system what we see. We're seeing the last few days really great preprints looking at coding of megaspaces, distance coding, all sorts of things going on in there that come out of these things. But No, I think there's a lot to navigation that we miss in a lot of the hippocampal work.
I really want to hear from Nidhi. I just want to say I don't think the cerebellum and the hippocampus are really that comparable, but I want to hear from Nidhi first.
Sure. Yeah. So let me go with, I asked a couple of questions. So let me go with the more upvoted one. So a lot of your work, I mean, first of all, amazing experiments. I would love to play with the data if possible. But so you've spoken a lot about, some factors underlying navigation path choices. Have you looked into navigation speeds at all? And what sort of factors do you think underlie sort of navigation speed choices in these kinds of experiments?
By speed choices, do you mean how quickly people can make the choices, or what's your...
No, the actual movement speed.
How does speed affect these things?
Right.
Yeah, no, we haven't. I haven't played with that particularly. It is an important one, but we haven't particularly manipulated that. It's not been something we've gone after. But I think you're right. And I really, the thing that struck me working with rats and humans, I wouldn't have had if we hadn't put these two together. Is wow, rats move fast and they like to cover a lot of space. Humans like to look at things and then do things, and so that speed then comes into it about how we naturally move. It's more than speed, but speed is an important, but it's not something we particularly looked at. You said you had another question as well. Right?
Yeah. So the other one was in your human navigation experiment. The one with 1 million people or what? So there, did you see any sort of correlations between how much people explored in the initial part of the map, like their exploration versus how good versus bad a navigator they were?
Interesting. We've mainly just been quantifying people, so they have to get to a target. So there's the extent to which they're exploring and investigating isn't something we've looked at. So it's a good question. So the way one might look at that is in the maps where you can't tell how you're going to find your way. You are going to have to explore it, and we haven't looked at, can we predict the optimal exploration patterns from people? That would be really nice, I think, to see. Again, it would be nice to find things like 18-year-olds aren't quite as optimal maybe at that. As you get older, you get a bit wiser. I don't know. But there are some patterns in the data. Later into the game, for example, there are levels where you memorize the map, you go into it, and then rocks fall in various places, and you're having to mentally update the map to think, right, okay. And then some of them are quite big, so people replay them, and they can look at that. So we're quite interested in how there's a level as well in the game which repeats. You just don't know. Like, it's all the environment, all the stimuli have changed, everything, but the same structure is repeated. There we see people are really good at navigating, no benefit. But if you're bad at navigating, that subtle repetition actually really does help bring out better navigators. So something about you that they benefit from repetition more. They've still got more to go. And I don't think it's just the ceiling effect, but it's just something we need to delve into more. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
So we have Max Ted instead that have been waiting, and Blake Porter. And I think that it's very late, so this should be sort of towards the end tail of our.
And if Max Ted is here, tell us what your username is, because I don't see him. I try to invite him, or her, or them. I love. Do you love the sound of John typing as much as I do, Ida?
Yes. The 1950s typewriter.
I assume he's typing us a love letter.
1930s, I'll have
Excuse me.
He kept it from his teenage years.
Shots fired.
All right,
Blake, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Hugo. Thanks for the talk.
Hi there.
That's great. So one of the big things it seems like a lot of fMRI studies on the hippocampus, you have distance encoding is so strong, such a strong bold signal. Whereas in rats, in electrophysiology, it's not a weaker signal, but it seems like more elusive, and it was really only recent results. Elle linked your paper from 2017 and the bat goal vector cells have just sort of more recently been sort of found, but it still doesn't seem obvious how we go from the place cell place code of space to a distance metric, or how that's calculated. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that and how that distance metric is sort of comes about and it's calculated.
Yeah. Well, there are two questions: how might these be related, and how does that calculation, how does the system calculate the distance? I guess one of the simplest stories with Caswell and I wrote a review back in 2015. So a very simple hand wavy idea is that, of course, if an animal is going to navigate a short distance to a goal, it's not got so many place cells to reactivate. It's going to do a replay to that target. Whereas if it's got a lot further to go, you're going to engage a lot more of the cells in your replay events, or you're going to require to link together more ripple events. And there is data to suggest that that's the case. And David Reddish had quite a nice paper on the theta sequences sweeping to further goals. So that's a hand wavy kind of, like, I'm not so sure how well that's been developed into specific models, but the idea, maybe Andrei Bukansky's model with Neil Burgess might be the kind of example to look at for that. But the idea that when you're planning a route, you might replay ahead, and if you've got more space to run that through, you might need to. You might require more cells. So that might be one of the mechanistic explanations of why you might see bold. But you're right, there are other papers like the bat cells where it's just a raw signal suggesting that the cells in themselves build, that there's more density of cells near the goal, so you get increasing in that case. There are other papers where orienting journeys towards the goal show more cell activity. So there's a range of different papers. I'm actually in the process of writing a review with Caswell and Eleanor, she's still on here and commenting in the comments. And Niels Nyberg is the first author on that. So we're just hopefully going to get that pulled together. Just every day something new comes out, we need to add to this ongoing epic review. But in that, we will try and spell out the answer to what you've been asking. It's still unknown. It's a really unclear question. But yeah, the link between the place cells and the bold signal is far, but that would be the simplest one about ripple events driving more. But it's just one hand wavy. Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like with Caswell's, if you're getting from his talk yesterday, we have really more fields instead of more cells, so it wouldn't really just be more place cells firing for a greater distance based on that work. But yeah.
So you think it would be more cells just firing?
Well, wasn't it with Caswell? It was not so many more place cells, but that the place cells that were active had more fields and bigger fields, so that you couldn't just say, oh, more place cells fired, so it's a further distance, because the same place cells, or not as many place cells, just have bigger fields and more fields. So it seems a little trickier than just more cells, more distance.
No, I think you're right. That certainly seems to have qualified coming in. It's not quite as simple as that. And I think, one thing that's not been entirely clear to me is the extent to which the ripple events are. So what we're picking up in the bold signal may well be more tied to that, which may not necessarily be the fields or the individual cell activity. But there's definitely more to be done in this domain. You're absolutely right to ask about it.
Cool, thanks.
No problem. Thanks for asking.
Okay, we have, what was your ID? User 87C257AC.
So catchy.
High security username. I just wanted to make sure I had something very very individual and unique. Firstly, thanks so much, Hugo. It was a absolutely fascinating talk, and I know that it's quite late for you. I'm here in the UK as well, and I haven't been able to tear my eyes away from the screen at 11. And thanks for the host as well. It's such a fascinating series, and really appreciate the work you guys have been doing. So Hugo, my question was around the London taxi drivers and the delays in recognizing which street to go down. And one of the things that was really interesting me is that I was listening to John O'Keefe's talk yesterday at the Royal Irish Academy, and he described the honeycomb maze where you had rats that would they had to select one of two different directions. And one of the things that interests me, and this was, I think, based on Shaftesbury Avenue and my knowledge of around the Strand and that area, but was there any relationship that you found between the angle that they were traveling on the street they were on and the angle of the correct next path to that delay in street selection?
No, that is something we need to look at. That's a fantastic. So that example I just played through today was sort of making me think, wow, have we not looked at this properly? We need to look at this again, because that example really stands out as a clear example. A lot of the streets are much more 90 degrees, so it's hard to get all these examples. But you're right. I think you would expect that the angle will play into it. You've got to get to somewhere, but to get there, you have to turn backwards on yourself. What we did look at in that data was circuity. So if you're on a route that's increasing and like you're going further from your goal, you're stepping towards it, but you're having to go further away, that doesn't tie into it. They're not slower when they're in a route that's out. But we do know that we've looked at things like regionality in that data, where they consider regions to be, and that really speeds up their responses. But one thing also would add to this data, since we're on that topic, just to finish on, is if you see some really big increases in the reaction time, one thing you can go back into this kind of data and say, look, wow, why did the taxi driver take so long here? It's not the street, it's not. You look back at the data and you see it's a clear divergence. There are two plausible routes. Half of them drive right, half of them drive left. You take in that and it explains another whole load of the data. So we've got that all written into this, but the angle we haven't looked at. But it's absolutely fascinating how long they can gap sometimes. Really sit and think about it. Ida, did you have a?
Yeah, a question to that. So does degree centrality play into this? Because is it just the two branches, or does it sort of increase with the larger degree centrality or eigencentrality, where it makes a big difference? If I take this one, then the next one is going to be like one-way street for a long time or something, so that accessibility or reachability changes as a result of a choice, or if the degree centrality is just high.
No, you're absolutely right. The first step analysis is the really broad, like what metrics can you just extract geographically? But when you look at the effect we see for main roads, that is very likely to be tunable down to that. So if you go to Oxford Street, if you consider that as an entity, as a unit, like a node, its degree centrality must be like 38 or maybe higher. Like there's 38 options out of that unit. So that would explain why they're so slow when they hit one of these potential points. But yeah, we are intending to really analyze. One of the key collaborators on that project is Daniel McNamee, who has this normative model of planning. So we designed all of the tasks. We went back and forward with Daniel to go, right, is this going to get at your model? Is that going to get at the model? I just didn't want to get into that today. So far, it's just basic geographical questions like main roads, not main roads.
I wonder whether the accessibility of all those 38 other options becomes more available to the memory, and whether the thing that's slowing down is the accessibility of all these things that just got activated. That's very fun. And I think behaviorally potentially testable. So if you remind me of a particular street that's connected to 38 other exits or something, then my reaction time to a question that the answer to that question is one of those 38 streets should be faster than if,
That's right.
One of the things I really loved about it was the behavioral element of it, compared to where we looked at some of the really physiological measures of navigation. One of the things that really stood out to me as such an exciting experiment about that is the links to the behavior. And I thought it was fascinating. I'd love to see people trying to do it on a tube map of London and the connections and the nodes as well. I think it'd be fascinating. But thank you guys so much. It was a fascinating learning session. It was really brilliant.
Thank you very much. And just to note, that has been done in a past study with Chris Summerfield and Demis Hassabis. We were looking at a tube map. It wasn't in London, but it was an imaginary one. They had to learn over an hour and then navigate, and we could see lots of the things you're imagining, going backwards, twitching lines. They all have reaction time costs.
Thank you so much.
Hugo, I had a question. I'm sorry. I just had a question, Hugo, about going back to hippocampus, place cells, grid cells. Do you have an opinion? And I don't know how replicated these studies are, but when people claim they find place cells and grid cells in other parts of the brain other than the hippocampus, what does one? I mean, and this is what should one conclude from that? That they are being used in a different way, or that they're able to have that function outside of the hippocampal hookup? How does one think about those cells that people are beginning to find outside of the hippocampus?
Yeah, it's been an exciting time. Somebody made a joke on Twitter about like this hippocampal world freak thing where you've got to decide which brain area doesn't have place cells in it as a test. Are you a human? So yeah, it's really in the last weeks or year this has exploded. I think it's that we've seen this in other brain area circuits where something you thought was just supposed to be in this area turns out to be elsewhere as well. And I think this makes sense from that principle that the system isn't entirely just completely modular. You're only going to get this in here, but that's a really simplistic answer to it. Annoyingly, perhaps the first thing that comes to my mind, and certainly I saw on Twitter, is the amount of, if someone says they've got a place cell, there's just hundreds of sort of extra tests to show it really is a place cell. Like, does it stay on in the dark is number one, so it's not like this is some sort of like, absolutely, these are the categories. If it doesn't meet this, it's not really a place cell. But the question is more that if you're thinking about other bits of the brain, do they represent things? The good example, say, is the anterior thalamic head direction cells have certain very particular properties for head direction. And you see those in you see head direction cells in other bits of the brain, but they have different tuning properties to different aspects of the environment. And so they get superficially, that's very sweet. They superficially have similar looking patterns, but actually there's other deeper things going on. That's my perspective, that some of these principles will spread across the brain, but that if you look deeper, there will be differences. I think that will really help.
Maybe another important sort of addition to that is that if you take out the hippocampus, they don't get formed. So they need. So if you look at the various parts of the brain where they observed place fields, they needed first. There was a direction going on. First, it had to form in the hippocampus and then go there. And if you took out the hippocampus or inactivated it, then it wouldn't get formed. So. We didn't get to say hi properly to the kid.
For you, Hugo, I had an anecdote for you. I wanted you to tell you that I remember, based on your studies of countries, and India was actually at the lowest, right? Which was interesting. I remember being in India and being in a cab in Mumbai, and I had my iPhone with me, and the taxi driver seemed to be a bit lost. So I went into Google Maps and I showed the driver where we were on Google Maps. And he looked at me like I was showing him hieroglyphics, right? It was absolutely, he had no idea. And when I tried to say, look, this is us, and it was really interesting that I don't know whether it was compressing it down onto a phone but actually it had no facility at all. Zooming down onto the space. It was really interesting. So I just had to give up. Yeah. And I just saw it when I looked at your map. I'm misreading it.
No, you're right.
India was,
we're still working. So that's true. That matches that is a nice anecdote. And I somebody wrote to me when we published it saying, I'm currently living in Vietnam and I cannot get around. The taxi drivers here are utterly awful. And I'm glad to see there's some data here that matches my experience of actually traveling. I think it was Vietnam. I should qualify that. But we have been looking at which countries are good at self-estimating as a population, how good they think they are. And in India, I think, is one of the best countries in the world for guessing their navigation skill, as I remember. India and Australia, for some reason. But we're still working on publishing that data. It's still in progress. But there's going to be some very interesting cultural differences in overestimation. You have to guess which countries think they're way, way better at navigating than they actually, as in they self-rate. You look at the population of people self-rating. And then... So which countries have the biggest egos, basically, is the question.
Although I have to say, if you're a white tourist, European accent, the taxis might actually take a longer turn because they can charge you more. And it's very easy for them to, because they think that you have the bias that they're not smart enough. They will pretend that they're not smart enough and charge you for it. So you never know. Maybe he actually knew what you're showing him and was pretending.
That same taxi driver was talking to me about the neuroscience that I was doing there. So I don't think they were trying to be dumb at all.
About the map, maybe, because they could charge you more. They were actually smart, as you can see. They could talk about neuroscience. But when it comes to map, oh, no, I don't get it. So let me take it further. So, You never know what the whether they were too smart rather than not smart enough. In terms of overestimation, what were your findings again? The overconfidence and overestimation of skill.
Yeah, we're still looking at publishing that, where it just requires a lot of careful analysis, where you're just looking for confounding factors and things with this mass data. What can we do to really scrutinize it? But we were looking to see which countries, if people in each country are very good at saying, yeah, we're not very good at navigating as a culture, they'll get that right, and some countries might be actually really good at navigating, and they know that. So what we were looking at was to see if that matches up, and it came out that India was actually very good at estimating where they rank in the world, and so was Australia. And there are different points in the table, so it's like, why are those countries so on the money? But I won't, I don't want to let the let people know too early what we're finding. But it's there's some countries out there that way overestimate how good they are, and they're clustered highly geographically, culturally clustered. But you have to wait to read that.
That's very
yeah. We've also been looking at overconfidence, the people who drop out. Can you spot them can you predict them and so on? And yeah, you can analyze all sorts of overconfidence effects in the data.
Are overconfident people more likely to drop out?
Yeah, they think they're great, and then they realize as they go on. Oh. But yeah, we again, a lot of detailed analysis to look at these topics. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So Hugo, I also had a question about your humans versus rats versus RL agents, where you had that, if I understood it, in the humans, there was like a tie between model-based and successor representation. Did people was there like a habit effect in individuals? In other words, if one individual did successor, they always did successor, or did they alternate, or was there, how stable was the way
that is a great question. I think that's a great question. We'll go back and look at that. We didn't, if I remember right, we didn't look at whether for an individual, do they stay stable over time. I suspect there's a degree of diversity there, that they may not be so stable, but we definitely have to look. And it would be interesting to see if you could predict the really unstable ones. Like a couple of trials in, can you say, yeah, this animal or this human is not they're gonna be, not just their accuracy, that's quite boring, but something about the way they solve the task is so that is the kind of interesting. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah. Do you have the data to do that? Do you think? Do you have enough trials?
There's 250 trials, so we should do, I think, in that data, be able to at least look at it. We've been able to take, one of the things Will did that I quite like was he took a support vector machine to say, right, well, we take the models, and you take this model, can it predict which, if you've got the 3 different reinforcement learning agents, can you predict which model it was from the set if you take all the trajectories out of them? And you can train it up to be, and it's not perfect, and that's what makes it interesting. You take that system that's trained on the RL trajectories and say, right, what were these rats and humans doing? And again, that data shows that the best matching prediction in a lot of cases is the successor representation, where it's confusing. The support vector machine thinks, what was this rat or it doesn't know it's a rat or a human. It thinks it's one, in terms of applying that kind of thinking to a support vector machine, it classifying the human or rat as a successor representation more. But the humans are more likely to be misclassified as model-based reinforcement learning agents as well. So there's a kind of sense in the system that overall successor representations the best match, but for humans it's a little bit more model-based, which makes a lot of sense. But yeah, there's a lot further to go. We've been playing around with how to make that task better, and there's ongoing active work. Might be possibly someone in the lab late at night trying to collect data. We'll see. Yeah, Max has just highlighted, rats certainly do piss around, and we don't have to lick and groom our fur coats all the time. We just get on with the task, because they're constantly having. Yeah, sure, I spoke too fast. But yeah, I mean, I've wondered about experiments where just like puffing air in people's eyes occasionally, and they just get annoyed and they have to sort of stop doing it to take time out from the task. Might match rats and humans a bit more, but it's not, it's hard to get that. There's no perfect way of doing it, but there's certainly a lot of similarities in their trajectories in our task. Really, there's a lot. So it's a nice sort of, that's been really exciting to look at that.
Yeah.
You also did something that I don't know if you mentioned. because humans are very vision oriented, and the virtual maze that you made, you added a fog so that the vision is a little more obstructed, so it's not unfair for visually seeing what's going on further on. So they have to actually rely on representations.
That's absolutely right. Early experiments, we just blurred things to make it difficult, but we found that humans could even just detect slight pixels was enough. So we actually have to like a fog right around them. They can just see, oh gosh, there's an edge and I'm going to fall into the lava. So it's quite important. Unfortunately, Chris Scanstrom, who's the video I showed, just got a fantastic setup working with 3D tracking in a 10 by 10 meter space with lava and everything. And then COVID hits. So nobody's been back into that space to wireless immersive VR, but we're running it through.
Chris worked with me on a SR project at summer school too. I forgot that he also works with you. That's awesome.
That's right. Small world.
Yeah. I'm sure that you're very tired. What time is it there? It's like 11:15.
Quarter past 11. It's okay. We'll do a little bit more. Yeah.
I just want to thank you so much for staying so long into your into almost your midnight.
Thank you.
And Hugo, I don't want you to think we gave you a hard time.
No, it's great.
We give everyone a hard time.
Oh, no, I've been watching them, so I know. It's great.
Work.
We need more people giving each other a hard time and going, what do you really mean by this? We don't, that's what we're missing in a lot of these public talks. They're just too nice. We need to have, that's what's so great. I really appreciate being on here. And it's amazing seeing the text, the scrolling on the side of people commenting and highlighting bits.
Also, some of the questions in the ask a question box, some people ask questions and others answer under it with references, and I like that a lot as well.
Yeah.
Elle has been great. Eleanor has been great in sending a lot of citations too.
She's
Ron, do you have any other questions?
Well, I think Hugo, I think it's true, right? Ida, Jova, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Hugo can have access to the chat later, right? If he wants to read through it. Right, so because you might have missed questions and comments, and so we'd like
that would be very useful
so that you can
Thank you. Absolutely.
Also, you might have missed it at some point. Jovo was saying in the chat that he can host your data or something. What was that, Jovo?
Yeah, I host like hundreds of terabytes of neuroscience data. If you have, it's relatively easy for us. We've spent a decade building everything.
Great.
So we're happy to help.
Thank you very much. Yeah, might well do that. That sounds good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
So so for me, thanks to all of you, but also the people in adding stuff in the background in the chat and adding. It's amazing. So thank you again so much. Amazing experience. I look forward to the next upcoming salons as well. Keep it going.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you loads.
I just also want to thank Claire and Kanaka and Brad and Eva, who are behind the scenes of the salon. And with that, I guess. Good night, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much, Hugo. I hope it's not too late and you fall asleep.
That's good.
Good night. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.